big show in 2020.
And late this afternoon, amid mounting questions about the phone call and what Trump actually said to Putin, the White House tried to reassert control over the narrative.
The president's made clear to everybody, every person that's not an American voter has no business in our elections. We've said it a lot, and we're actually doing things to prevent everybody from meddling in our elections, something the other administration failed to do. Let's not forget that any interference in any election didn't take place under this president. It took place under President Obama. We're actually taking steps to stop it and make sure that it doesn't happen again.
And here for our lead-off discussion on a Friday night, Donnie Deutsch, whose new show, Saturday Night Politics, debuts tomorrow night, Saturday night, 8 p.m. Eastern, right here on MSNBC. Kara Lennig, Pulitzer Prize-winning investigative reporter for The Washington Post. Jeremy Bash, former chief of staff at the CIA and the Pentagon, as well as former chief counsel for the House Intelligence Committee. And Michael McFaul, former U.S. ambassador to Russia. Thank you all for being with us. Kara, let me just start with you. This phone call, this communication between President Trump and Vladimir Putin today, it had been a while, I think, at least as far as we know, since they'd spoken. Do you have any sense what precipitated this today?
No, other than the president saying, rather tasked, telling the American public that it was the president who initiated the call. And actually, you know, what's interesting about this call, Steve, is it feels every time they have a conversation and we learn little dribs and drabs of what they discussed, especially what they didn't discuss, it's a little bit of a shocker. But it is a continuation of the kinds of conversations that the president has had with Putin over the last 2 years. His primary focus is believing that he alone can have this great relationship building experience with Putin and that that's worth something. And he puts that above the national security concerns or the concerns of allies who see a hostile power who is messing with our democracy, ordering the poisoning of some of our of folks that he considers his enemies on foreign soil. He puts that relationship above a lot of things people think he should reprioritize.
Michael McFaul, I wonder from the standpoint of Putin and folks around him in Russia, how this conversation, at least as we now understand it, how they read it. If this is something that the president initiated, they certainly know the Mueller report came out recently. The president has this conversation, does not bring up this topic of election interference at all. What does that read as to Putin and folks in Moscow?
Great news. It means that maybe there's a possibility to engage directly with President Trump to achieve things that they want to achieve and to create a gap between the president and his administration. As you rightly pointed out, they are oftentimes not on the same page. And here's an example. If you read their readout, number one, initiated by us. So it's a good question. Why did we initiate the call? What was the objective of the call? But then when you read out the Russian side, they're putting down their markers about their policy. And Steve, I used to work at the White House for President Obama. I used to set up these phone calls with the Russians, and we would write the readout of the call before the call happened, tweak it perhaps, to state what our policy objectives were. So, for instance, if I were writing the readout, I would have said, we talked about how Russia should not interfere in Venezuela. We talked about how Russia should withdraw their forces and their support for separatists in Ukraine. We talked about how there'll be dire consequences if they intervene in our elections in 2020. The president's readout had none of that kind of language.
I wonder what you're describing, your sense with Trump and this administration. Do you think, have policy objectives in calling Putin? Or you've gotten the sense through the years this is just a guy in some ways he likes?
Well, I'd say two things. Number one, remember, president's words have consequences. I've heard what Secretary of State Pompeo said about the Russian interference in Venezuela, and what his own national security advisor, who works just down the hallway from him, what the president said about Venezuela in a good chat with Putin was completely at odds with them. So that undermines their leverage when they're speaking with the Russians. But to your broad point, I think the president has a theory of diplomacy that if he can just engage personally with Putin, he'll improve relations. He doesn't think about what are the concrete national security objectives he's seeking to advance. Instead, the goal for him is a good relationship with Putin, whereas that should be the means to try to achieve some other concrete objectives.
Donnie, just in terms of your